which I think it will shortly, we'll get started. All right. Good evening, everybody. I think we're just waiting on one panelist. As soon as my staff lets me know, we're waiting on a very important one, my colleague, Councilmember, Council President Katz. So there, I think I see him coming on now. Great. All right, we're gonna get rolling here. Unless someone tells me from my staff that I shouldn't. Right, there we go. I see you, Sydney. Great. Thank you for joining us. So welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining this town hall on policing, and particularly on how we reimagine policing and public safety here in Montgomery County. And it also provides a great opportunity for you all to hear some information on a recently released report that was commissioned and done by our Office of Legislative Oversight. And you're going to hear from two of our great team here, Dr. Elaine Bonner-Tompkins and Natalia Carasosa, who worked on this report, and they're from the County Council's Office of Legislative Oversight. We're also going to hear from Danielle Blocker, who is the president of Young People for Progress. So I want to thank her for joining us and all of her members. And my good friend and colleague, Dr. Rayshawn Ray, who's a professor of sociology at the University of Maryland, College Park, but also a David Rubenstein Fellow in Governance at the Brookings Institution, and a nationwide renowned expert on policing issues, and particularly, and lives in this region as well, knows a lot about the region as well. And so I want to thank all of you for joining. I'm going to make a couple of remarks and then turn to my colleague, Council President Katz, to give a brief welcome. And then we're going to go right in to the report that Dr. Bonner-Tompkins and Ms. Carasosa will go over what was found in that report. That'll take about 20 minutes. And then we will turn to reaction from the panel and then Q&A for the rest of the evening. So we're going to move expeditiously through. We received many questions through the chat, through the link that was sent out. We tried to condense and consolidate the ones that we received so that we can get to as many as possible. And we also have the ability to take Q&A through the Q&A function here, and we will try to address those either in real time, but at a minimum, we will follow up with everybody after and make sure every question that was submitted through the Google document and tonight gets an answer from our office. So we will get back to you on that. Just a couple of remarks I wanted to make. I've been in Montgomery County my entire life, and it's a great place. I love Montgomery County. I became a civil rights lawyer because I saw disparities here, and that's in every arena, whether it was educational, in healthcare, in our transportation infrastructure, but certainly as a young Black man in policing in the criminal justice system. And I think it's commonly said by people who experience policing differently, because that's what disparities mean. It means people have disparate experience with law enforcement. It's commonly said that if you don't do anything wrong, there's no reason you'll be stopped. You won't be pulled over, you won't be arrested, you won't be shot, you won't be harmed by law enforcement. But unfortunately, that has never been true here in the US. And it's important to note that some of the things we're going to get into tonight are going to show data that we have disparities here. We need to dig into that, and we need to understand that. But we also need to remember that this system in this country, the origins of policing, you can't have a discussion and just start in 2020. You have to remember that the beginnings of police in the South in particular were slave patrols that were used to round up escaped enslaved individuals. Later on in the Jim Crow era and after slavery, police used as state-sanctioned forms of violence to keep a caste system and a racist system in place for many years to deny people voting opportunities. And we're not talking about ancient history, we're talking about in the lives of people on this call. And that is the history of policing in this country, and is the history of policing everywhere. And in Montgomery County, the final point I want to make is we're a great place, but we're also not immune to the sickness and the disparities that we've seen nationwide. And we've had incidences here, both in the past and the present, that remind us of that. And that's what we're going to talk about tonight. And that doesn't mean our officers aren't great people. I worked at the police department for a year as an AmeriCorps member right after high school. And there's people I've known 20 plus years that are great officers and are serving the public with distinction. It means that we are operating in a system that over time has legacies and vestiges of racism and systemic inequity. And that's what we have to do. And that's what the work we've taken on as a council to address. So I'm excited that we're here tonight. And we're going to talk about some troubling things, what the data looks like. We're going to talk about the fact that of people who have died, Black men in this county, Robert White, Fanon Burhay, Emmanuel Okutuga, killed by our police. We've had our own names here in the county, and we need to wrestle with that, but then focus on the really important work of making sure that we build a better, stronger, more equitable, resilient system. And that's what reimagining public safety is about. So I'm excited to have this presentation. I think this data is crucial for us to take that first step. And we've taken some steps as a council already, but as a public and as a community, to look at where we are and move forward. So we'll talk about all those things tonight. So thank you all for joining us. I want to hand it over to my good friend and colleague, Council President Katz, who's also the chair of the Public Safety Committee, to make a few opening remarks.
Well, thank you, Councilmember Jawando, for allowing me to say a very quick hello. I want everyone to know that on the text that Will sent me, he said I have up to 2 minutes to speak this evening. So I'm gonna live with that. I'm gonna come in under budget. Just watch me. But I sincerely appreciate everyone being here this evening. You know, the other members of the council and I have many opportunities to speak, and we appreciate every one of those opportunities. But probably the most important part of our job is listening. And that's what tonight is all about, and for all of us. I know that, and I know that the sooner I stop speaking, the faster I can start listening. So that's what I'm intending to do. But I did want to say that it's so important that people tell us what they think. Just like Will, I grew up in Montgomery County as well, started a few years before he did, but I grew up in Montgomery County as well. I've seen Montgomery County change I grew up in the Gaithersburg area, and it was a farming area when I was younger, and it certainly is not that exact same way today. We've seen Montgomery County change. We've seen Montgomery County change in many ways for the better, but that doesn't mean in every way it's changed for the better. So we're here to listen, to learn, and to thank you for allowing us to do that. Thank you very much, Will, for allowing me to say a few words.
Thank you, Sydney. Thanks for joining. So with that, I'm going to turn immediately to Dr. Bonner Tompkins and to Natalia Carasosa to run through the OLO report. Thank you very much. And you're on a mute, Elaine. We've got our first mute attack for the.
That's right. And so good evening, everybody. I also need to have access to sharing my screen. So if we could have that happen, and we will run through the PowerPoint. All All right, and as that, okay, looks like I have it. Yep, awesome. All righty, so good evening again. My name is Elaine Bonner-Tompkins, and I'm joined by my colleague, Natalia Carrizosa from the Office of Legislative Oversight. We appreciate Councilmember Jawando providing us the opportunity to describe our recent report on Montgomery County Police Department policing data and best practices. We also appreciate his leadership in asking the council to request this report from the Office of Legislative Oversight. So for some of you all that don't know, the Office of Legislative Oversight is a part of the legislative branch of the council, of the county. Our mission is to provide accurate information, analysis, and independent findings and recommendations that help the county council fulfill its oversight function. Towards this end, each year, we publish a dozen or so reports on county-funded agencies at the request of the county council, and those reports are available online. So this slide provides an overview of the topics that we're going to cover tonight. I will begin by describing our assignment and our project's key findings. Natalia will cover the last 3 bullets describing disparities in police interactions with the public, our project's recommendations for our county council and police department action, as well as additional police department related projects that are included in our current work program.
Dr. Bonner-Tompkins, if I could just cut you off, it's looking
Sure.
like that we have the spotlight on you and not on the data presentation. So if my staff could address that, people can't see the.
Okay, so let me, I'll come out of that and let's see if I try it again and see what happens. Sorry about that. Thanks for flagging that.
I don't know if it was you or us, but.
Can you see a PowerPoint screen now?
Yeah, if people click on the slides, maybe it'll get bigger. Okay, look, it looks like it's working now. There we go.
All right, so this slide just gives an overview of what we're going to cover today. So our assignment was to respond to the County Council's request for us to review and describe Montgomery County Police Department data sets and data practices. So given the council's focus, the report highlights the police department's data sets that describe its interactions with the public, in particular policing data as compared to crime data. And our sources of information analyzed for the report included literature reviews on policing data, best practices, a review of annual reports on policing data from both state and local sources, as well as interviews with police department leadership and staff. So our first project finding is that best practices recommends the collection and monitoring of policing data. So while law enforcement agencies care about a number of priorities, what often gets prioritized for performance management is crime prevention. In response to the question of what metrics does the police department track, the most often cited answer among the various police department respondents we talked to was crime statistics. Jessica Sanders of the RAND Corporation, however, warns that to focus exclusively on one goal at the expense of others is to invite poor performance on alternative goals. She warns that in addition to statistics on property and violent crimes, police departments need performance metrics to incentivize and demonstrate constitutional policing that is bias-free, and that placing all emphasis on crime levels creates a dangerous tension because it often overlooks police officers' other roles and functions that should include police-community relations. Researchers such as Saunders and others find that best practices for tracking policing data have emerged from lessons learned among jurisdictions that have been under consent decrees to address bias policing. So generally, these jurisdictions, the ones that have been under consent decrees, commit to 2 policing data priorities. The first is the compiling and monitoring of data on police interactions with the public that are disaggregated by race, ethnicity, and location for both residents as well as personnel to uncover and track disparities in police interactions. that may result from biased policing. The second commitment they make is to collect data across 4 sets of police interactions with the public. The first set is data on detentions that includes stops, searches, citations, arrests, and use of force incidents. In particular, data are tracked for all stops and searches, not just those that result in law enforcement actions. Second, they collect data on police and resident-initiated contacts, as well as traffic accidents, to understand whether disparities among these interactions with law enforcement account for disparities in detentions if evident by race, ethnicity, and location. They also collect data on police complaints, civilian and internal complaints against the police that describe both the complaints by reason, disposition, and consequence. And then they also survey both residents and law enforcement officers on police-community relationships. Our second project finding is that the police department tracks several policing data points that are summarized on this chart above. The department collects both crime and policing data across several data sets that are maintained electronically. Excerpts of the crime and policing data sets that the police department compiles and utilizes are available as open data in Data Montgomery are marked in this chart with the delta. And those that are reported via annual reports by the police department are marked by asterisks. Last year, the council enacted the community policing law, Bill 3319, that will require the police department to report additional data on use of force in detentions by race, ethnicity, and gender, civilian complaints against the police regarding the use of force, discrimination, and harassment, data on officers suspended with and without pay, data on youth referred to intervention programs, as well as data on service calls received for substance abuse and mental health issues. Our third project finding is that several of the police department's data sets align with best practices. These include data on detentions for disaggregated by race and ethnicity for traffic stops, arrests, and uses of force. The ability to track police-public interactions using the police department's computer-aided dispatch system, as well as the tracking of police complaint data by the Internal Affairs Division. Yet there are some Montgomery County Police Department data sets that do not align with best practices. For example, the police department does not track street stops that include stops and frisks. They do not, in particular, track interactions that do not result in an arrest, a citation, or a summons. Nor does the police department maintain an electronic database of criminal and civil citations. Additionally, the police department's existing forms and systems do not consistently record data on ethnicity. The police department's internal affairs database also does not collect race and ethnicity data on complainants. And the police department does not survey nor report perceptions of police community relations among residents or staff. Our fourth project finding is that the police department's internal data sets offer more information than either its annual reports or the data that's available in Data Montgomery. The Montgomery County Police Department's annual reports and open data sources include only a subset of the information they collect, in particular for the arrest data, as well as the internal affairs data that's reported, for example, in Data Montgomery. So as the council exercises its oversight, it should continue to pose questions directly to the police department because their internal data sets provide more information than their annual reports or open data sources. And then our fifth project finding is that disparities by race and ethnicity are evident in the police department's interactions with the public. As already noted, there are some gaps between the data and what is collected, but for the data that is available, the disparities in police interactions by race and ethnicity are fairly consistent and persistent across the different data points. For example, although African Americans accounted for 18% of the county's population, they accounted for 32% of the police department's traffic stops in 2018, 44% of the police department's arrests in 2017, and 57% of the police department's use of force incidents in 2019. Analyses of traffic violation data also evidence additional disparities by race, ethnicity, and gender. To delve more into the analysis of what available policing data describes, I'm going to pass the baton to Natalia to describe the disparities data in greater detail. And then she'll also close out our presentation by describing our recommendations and then additional reports that we have on deck for the next fiscal year regarding policing.
Thank you, Elaine. So the purpose of this project was to describe MCPD's collection of data. The project was not primarily about analysis of data, but in order to inform future data requests, we used publicly available policing data from Data Montgomery to provide examples of the types of analysis that could be done. In particular, the Data Montgomery traffic violations data set, which includes data on the race and ethnicity as well as gender of drivers that were stopped for traffic violations, offers several avenues for analysis of police interactions with the public. In this and the following slides, I'm going to provide a few examples. So before I go ahead with that, I do want to mention that disparities by race and ethnicity that appear in these data do not prove that there is bias in policing. And when I say bias, I mean people being treated differently on the basis of their race, ethnicity, or gender. But they do indicate that further investigation is advisable. This slide shows the number of traffic stops by race, ethnicity, and gender as a percentage of adult population of each group in the county. And it shows wide disparities in rates of traffic stops. So for example, the number of stops of Black women represented 18% of the population of Black women in the county, while the number of stops of Black men represented 38% of the population of Black men in the county. And then for comparison, the number of stops of white women in 2019 was 10% of the population of white women. And the number of stops of white men represented 17% of the population. Two caveats to this are that an individual can be stopped more than once. So a rate of 17% does not necessarily mean that 17% of white men were stopped in 1 year. And I also want to mention that some drivers are residents of other jurisdictions. So this, the next slide shows traffic stop data by geographical location using the county's administrative election districts. There are 13 election districts in the county defined by the Board of Elections. And this slide shows data for the 6 districts with the most traffic stops. It displays there in that first column of numbers, the stops per 100 population for each district. And it shows that District 7, which includes Bethesda, Glen Echo, and Somerset, had the highest rate of traffic stops relative to its population, with 14 traffic stops per 100 population in 2019. The rest of the table shows the difference between the percentage of traffic stops for each racial or ethnic group and the population percentage for that group. For example, in District 13, which includes Silver Spring and Wheaton Glenmont, the percentage of traffic stops where the driver was identified as Black was 15 percentage points higher than the population of Black residents in the district. As the table shows, Black drivers were stopped at disproportionate rates across geographical areas, but there are some significant differences in that disproportionality. For example, if you look at District 7, where the difference is 17 percentage points. That's Bethesda, Glen Echo, and Somerset. And you compare it with District 5, which is Burtonsville and White Oak. That one only has a 9% difference in percentage point difference. So one caveat to these data is that they only include stops conducted by MCPD officers. They don't include traffic stops by other police departments such as Gaithersburg or Rockville. And also, like in the previous slide, the data do include stops of drivers that are not residents of the district in which they were stopped. So on the next slide, we show traffic stops in terms of the number of violations per stop. It is common for police to cite drivers with more than one violation during a single stop. And this table shows that Black and Latinx drivers were less likely than white drivers to receive just one violation during a stop, and more likely to receive numerous violations during a stop. So for example, 22% of Latinx drivers stopped received 6 violations compared with 10% of white drivers. In the next slide, we look at types of violations by race and ethnicity. And this table shows the top 10 violation types that drivers were cited for in 2019. It shows that the distribution of violations by race and ethnicity varies greatly by the type of the violation. So for example, the distribution of speeding violations, which is the most common type of violation, was relatively close to the population distribution in the county. Black drivers accounted for 24% of violations and 18% of the population. Latinx drivers accounted for 18% of violations and 19% of the population, and white drivers accounted for 42% of violations and 44% of the population. But if you then look at the distribution for the violation that is referred to as the failure to display registration card upon demand by a police officer, Black drivers received 34% of violations and white drivers received 32% of violations in this category. Overall, we saw that violations that are related to actions taken while driving, such as speeding or failing to stop when required, tended to match the county's population a little bit more closely, while violation types that related to registration documents, registration plates, and driver's licenses were more likely to reflect a disproportionate number of Black and sometimes Latinx drivers. And so finally, the last example that we have tonight is searches conducted during traffic stops. This table shows that Black and Latinx drivers were searched at higher rates than other groups, with 3.8% and 3.4% of stops respectively, resulting in a search for these two groups, compared with 2.6% of stops resulting in a search for all drivers, and 1.6% of stops resulting in a search for white drivers. The slide also shows the percentages of searches by the reason for the search. So you can see that the different reasons listed here are probable cause, incident to arrest, consensual, and canine. Just as a note, probable cause refers to the idea that the officer had sufficient reason based upon known facts to believe that a crime has been committed or that certain property are connected with a crime. Incident to arrest just means that the officer was arresting a person and therefore was permitted to conduct a search as a result of the arrest. The data show that searches of Black drivers were more likely to be based on probable cause as opposed to other reasons. In particular, another reason being incident to arrest. For other groups, incident to arrest was a more frequent reason for conducting a search. So I'm now going to go over the 6 recommendations that are in the OLO report. The first recommendation is for the County Council to define the term detention in the county's community policing law, Bill 3319, to include all stops, searches, citations, arrests, and use of force. The second recommendation is for MCPD to track and report data on street stops. Sorry, I think we've lost the, there we go. as I said, the second recommendation is for MCPD to track and report to data on street stops, meaning stop and frisks and field interviews. The third recommendation is for MCPD to regularly survey residents and staff on police community relations and contacts. The fourth recommendation is for MCPD to build capacity to use policing data to advance best practices in constitutional and community policing. The fifth recommendation is for MCPD to collect and report data on race and ethnicity for every policing data set. And then the sixth recommendation is for MCPD to post additional policing data on Data Montgomery that aligns with their internal data sets, including data on criminal and civil citations. To close, I'm going to provide some information on 4 additional MCPD related projects that OLO is going to undertake in this year's work program. The slide lists the different projects. They include studying other jurisdictions that have reassigned traffic safety enforcement to their departments of transportation, public safety responses to mental health situations, and labor agreements with county police officers. This concludes our presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Elaine and Natalia. That was a lot of information in a very quick period. So thank you very much for going through that. I think it's very important. And for the people who have asked, the link to that report has been shared, and we will share it again for anyone that joined late. I wanted to point out 2 things, and I want to ask Dr. Ray and Ms. Blocker about their quick responses to that report, and then we're going to go into the questions. I requested this report after being on the council and trying to get data that I thought should be readily available. Things like how many people have received a trespass violation, and what's the race and ethnicity, and where did those things occur? Things that are basic questions, and just for people who don't know, a trespass order says that if you return to this place within 1 year, you're subject to a criminal trespass arrest, and they're issued. And I found out that they were being kept in paper copy at each station, and that data was not being collected. It's an example of you can't know that there's disproportionality and how to improve practice if you're not tracking certain things. And if things are being tracked, but they're very hard to get to, and the public isn't aware of them, you can't improve practice. So all the recommendations that were made by OLO, I'm drafting a bill with the support of Councilmember Katz and others to address those recommendations, which are very common sense recommendations, to make sure that we have all the data we need to improve practice and make sure that there's equitable and non-biased and constitutional policing in the county. So I just wanted to state that up front. But I want to turn to Dr. Ray first, just for any initial, again, just a couple of minutes of comments on that report, and then we'll do Ms. Blocker, and then we'll go into the questions.
Well, Councilman Jawando, thank you for giving me the opportunity. I just want to commend Montgomery County because you all are definitely ahead of the curve, and I'll say something about that in a second. I definitely want to thank Dr. Elaine Bonner-Thompson and her colleagues for the work that they are doing. I mean, it is definitely very, very important work. Natalia as well, great job. So as Councilman Jawando said, I've been studying policing for quite a bit of time, about 10 years. And at the University of Maryland, I have a center. It's called the Lab for Applied Social Science Research. A lot of the work we do is on policing. And one thing I know from working with dozens of police departments around the country, to interviewing and conducting implicit bias trainings with thousands of police officers, and then also having police officers in my family as well, is that these outcomes we're seeing in Montgomery County are not surprising as it relates to racial disparities in traffic stops and use of force, but also mental health. Oftentimes the disparities we see by race are just as large when we look at mental health, and that's something that we should be looking at. I'll say something about that in a second. One assumption that oftentimes people make about arrest and use of force is that the people who are being arrested deserve to be arrested. However, there's one big factor that Natalia highlighted, and that is who oftentimes not only gets stopped, but who gets searched to allow for trumped up citations. So that 6+ is something that's important. So oftentimes the interviews we've done with residents in Montgomery County and Prince George's County and others, particularly Blacks and Latinos, talk about how officers are trying to find multiple citations on them. Part of what happens is that officers are looking for people who they think have multiple violations. Not only are they speeding, but then they have a broken tail light. They're thinking that maybe they might have a suspended license. And then officers are asking for, or actually demanding or taking credence to actually look at all these various things. And there's a study that I want to highlight quickly that mimics some of the things that's happening in Montgomery County that unfortunately highlights bias and racial bias. It was a large study in New York City a few years ago that looked at stops and searches, similar to what Montgomery County is doing now. And what that study found, going a step farther, is not only were Blacks and Latinos more likely to be stopped, very similar to Montgomery County, about 50% were Black, about a third were Latino. And I think New York City is a good comparison for Montgomery County because it's so racially diverse. But also, over 90% of the time, the people who were stopped weren't necessarily committing any sort of criminal violation. They might have been committing some sort of traffic violation, but those are different things. And then the rate of use of force was also a huge disparity. I think there are 4 things in addition to the recommendations that we heard that are important. The first that they highlighted is comprehensive data reporting. Let me tell you why that's important. Research documents that departments that have comprehensive data reporting decrease their use of force by 25%. Now, in some regards, Montgomery County is already extending that. So looking at the report also put together by the police department, we see some of that pattern. But of course, everyone is aiming to continue to get better. The second thing revolves around de-escalation training, that police departments that put in place comprehensive de-escalation training and a de-escalation continuum decreases use of force by 15%. You put those 2 factors together, you can cut a lot of the racial disparities down by about 40% by doing those 2 things, one of which Dr. Thompson's team is already doing in regards to comprehensive data. Third and fourth things. Third thing is doing now a call for service audit, a call for service evidence-based audit, looking at calls for service and figuring out what are the calls for service that start off being nonviolent, that then turn violent, versus that continue being nonviolent. Nationally, over 90% of calls for service have nothing to do with violence at all. It doesn't mean that it can't turn violent, but it's important to do that audit to figure out if Montgomery County is aiming to shift or reallocate some of those calls for service, what are the best ones to do? And then finally, at the Lab for Applied Social Science Research, we have an advanced virtual reality training program that some officers from Montgomery County have participated in. And I can tell you, some of the officers who are advanced in mental health training from Montgomery County are some of the best that I've seen. That is something that needs to be replicated not only throughout the department, but also throughout the region and the nation. And we have a train the trainer course that some people from training from Montgomery County have taken. That is a train the trainer course on racial equity. And our virtual reality program allows for us to be able to examine the ways that bias might seep into traffic stops, mental health stops, and also suspicious person encounters. And this is a training that we'll be able to offer to Montgomery County if they're interested. So I'll stop there and look forward to the question and answer period.
Thank you, Dr. Ray. Ms. Blocker, any comments on what you heard today?
Absolutely. Can folks hear me?
Yes.
Perfect. Well, first I want to say thank you so much for allowing us to be here and allowing YPP to co-sponsor this with you all. And thank you to Dr. Bonner-Tompkins and Ms. Carisosa, I hope I pronounced your name right, for all of the work that you all did and the work with the other researchers as well. This is an issue that my organization, Young People for Progress, has been working with since last year, when a number of our members, actually, I'll take a step back. Last May, when a number of young Black men were stopped on a Thursday morning while waiting for a ride to work by police outside of McDonald's in White Oak. They were detained, they were searched, and a lot of the things that Dr. Ray mentioned happened in that encounter. And at the time, there were a number of members of Young People for Progress who were former classmates of one of the young men who was stopped. Actually, the young man who was videotaping it all. So I think absolutely transparency, just having these things recorded so that we know what is happening and what are the circumstances of what's happening is super important. I think transparency is an important tool once we've decided we want to act, right? And transparent data, it allows us to make the right and informed decisions once we are already working to make improvements on this thing, whatever the problem is. Here are many issues with policing in Montgomery County. I do want to say that transparent data, right, and extensive data collection alone is not enough. I think back to a few years ago when there was a huge push in cities and municipalities across the country for body cams, saying, you know, if we have body cams, it'll make a lot of improvements, which it did. But just data or just transparency alone won't solve the problems, which is, you know, what we've seen. We look at Robert White, who was killed in Silver Spring 2 years ago. The officer was wearing a body camera. You know, we have lots of information about how that occurred, but it still doesn't stop it from occurring. So I will also say that in addition to more data collection and more transparent and easily accessible data, there has to be accompanying action that is going along with that. And there have been folks, Councilmember Jawando, you're one of them, who have acted to make improvements on some of what we learned, which is extremely important, right? That's not to say that information and data collection isn't important and that people's experiences don't need to be recorded. They absolutely do. Especially in the example that I just mentioned earlier, it was a stop, right? That was not a traffic stop, right? And so that is data right now that's not being recorded, right? And so it's important for those stories to get told and that information to be recorded. And to that point, we are doing a lot of recording and collection of information now. Young People for Progress is doing a project actually with the Silver Spring Justice Coalition, interviewing people about their interactions with police in Montgomery County, right? And we've recently started working with a number of student organizations, Montgomery County Students for Change, Students Toward Equitable Public Schools, Youth for Equity, some organizations that are formed particularly around this issue, like MoCo Against Brutality, that are also collecting information on students' interactions with police in schools that we'll be publishing. We hope to publish a report on some of that, but we'll be publishing many of those instances in the near future online on Police Stories MoCo, of both incidents of Montgomery County residents' interactions with county police, both outside of school and inside of school. But anyway, I digress. I will speed up because I know that there is limited time here. I do want to say that I've been able to do some of the interviews for this project, not all, but some. And many of the interviews that we have done with residents and their interactions with Montgomery County, and most of the interviews of interactions that have been negative, there have been just as many that were not traffic stops, actually more, as those with traffic stops. You know, just of some that I've done, I can think of 3. One happened last year when a young man in his late teens was actually at the bus stop, the public bus stop, on his way to school, on his way to classes in the afternoon, when he was stopped, held for 2 hours and searched. And then they found, oh, you know, there's nothing on you. You're free to go, right? And so that wasn't an arrest, wasn't anything recorded on that. Another person that I interviewed, they're in their young 20s, but as a high schooler in Silver Spring, on the way, getting off from the school bus stop on her way back home, she was approached by police and asked about her classmates, saying, you know, those guys over there, are they selling drugs? Are they in gangs? She said no, and was very uncomfortable, but that is an interaction. I think both of those, they weren't doing anything wrong, etc. I think of one interview that I actually conducted recently with a young man who still lives in Montgomery County. All of the people I've mentioned so far are Black. But this young man, he's about 25 years old now, still lives here, upstanding citizen, never been arrested, all of those things. We'll talk about that later. But his first interaction with police was actually when he was in middle school, around 2008, 2009. He was playing basketball with friends in his neighborhood, and they went to the bus stop to take a bus to downtown Silver Spring. And while they were standing at the bus stop, police approached them and asked them if they were involved in gang activity. These Black middle schoolers said no, and then the police asked to take their pictures for a gang database. These police were bigger than them. There were multiple, and they were armed. So those Black middle schoolers said yes, not really sure that they felt like they had a choice. So this young man, the next day, he was in an after-school program. And the next day, he told one of the after-school program leaders that, you know, this happened. The after-school program leader took those boys to the police station, had them file complaints, talk to some staff, and later on, a police officer came to the after-school program to, you know, talk with the students, I think build trust, kind of get their feedback on how, you know, relations with the police and the community could be better.
Yeah.
That happened. And
I'm going to pause. Can I pause you there,
person,
Danielle?
I'll just say one more thing about this one story. That young man then went to high school and then had multiple negative experiences with police when he was in high school, being chased through parks by police, being stopped multiple times. Now, like after high school, stopped while driving multiple times. And so that conversation with the police and that after school program, maybe it helped. Maybe that helped the department improve a lot of its processes. That young man was still stopped multiple times afterwards, and now doesn't feel comfortable around police because he's had so many negative experiences. So I only say that, and then I only say that to just say that community surveys, data collection is absolutely important, and that these stories need to be told, and this information needs to be recorded, but we have to have action that is action other than more data collection or another study or task force or commission to make sure that these problems are actually being fixed. And we know what solutions we want. We, along with a number of other organizations, actually have 6 policy changes that we have met with officials with. 25 other organizations signed on that will publish soon, of what we as a community want. And now what we really need is leaders to really have the will and courage to make sure that happens. And with the data that we do have, whether it's 18%, whether it's Black people being 18% of the population, but much more of the stops, right? Or whether it's Black students in MCPS being what, 20% of the student population, but 50% of the arrests. We have enough data right now to act, but we need strong courage and political will of our leaders. And if they do, we will support them. So I know that was over time, but thank you.
We're gonna, that was a lot and it was important and it was good. And I know it's a monumental task to try to channel the stories and voices of so many young people that you are talking to as part of your project, but it's important. And I think it underscores what we just heard from Dr. Tompkins and Ms. Carasosa and Dr. Ray, that there are whole things, categories of things, interactions that aren't being tracked, and that have a corrosive effect on how certain communities, particularly Black communities, Latino communities, experience policing. And I've said it many times that if you're a white person in Bethesda, you experience policing and have a different view of police than a Black person in Briggs Cheney. And that's a fact. But I think that's why this is so important, because not everyone knows that. And it's not any individual person's fault that they don't know that, because you are based on your experiences. But that's why we have to talk to each other. We have to get the data out there so that we can have the will to, as you said, make the changes. So we're going to go to the rest of the evening to go to questions. I'm going to introduce, and I'm going to switch to a panelist now, and I'm going to turn it over to my council staff, senior legislative aide in my office, Fatma Taberi, who's going to moderate the Q&A portion.
Hello, everyone. How are you? So I'm going to go through some questions that we received from the audience and from the community. And I'll start off when I read out the question. I will start off with Councilmember Jawando, and then others can chime in. Dr. Ray and Danielle, y'all can chime in, and Dr. Bonner Tompkins if you so desire, and Natalia. So the first question is from Vivian, and Vivian asks, my son is 23 years old, and I want to know what could be done so that he can feel different about police in the county. He was stopped several times with no just cause, and the way he was treated was ridiculous. Also, what are the plans to change the training and the hiring process so that the force is more diversified? Councilmember Jawando?
Sure. Thank you, Vivian, for the question. I'll be brief because I'm sure others want to comment on this. You know, as I said, I've grown up here. I've been stopped, I don't know how many times. I've been stopped since I was a council member. I wrote about it last June, because I know it happens every day to so many people and they feel frustrated. The first two questions I was asked was, is this your car? And do you have any outstanding warrants? Then when I was finally told I was supposedly stopped because I stopped on a stop line at a stoplight, you know, on the stop line, and then wasn't issued a ticket. And it was one of many stops where I think a pretextual stop looking for additional information, additional violations. Was the car stolen? It was early in the morning. It was a nice car. I was in athletic clothing. And those types of experiences happen every day in others. And I think knowing the data is a part of it, but also changing the incentive structure is a part of it. And I've talked a lot about, and Dr. Ray mentioned this, or I think Dr. Tompkins and Dr. Ray mentioned this. We need to track and value positive interactions and de-escalation just as much as we track and value stops, tickets, and arrests. I've seen these boards in the county police department, and we're not unique in this way. This is a federal, state, and local problem, where you have a whiteboard in a police station, and you have at the top, you have the officer with the most arrests and stops, and at the bottom, you have the officer with the least arrests and stops. And there's an implicit and explicit expectation that you go and get those numbers. We had a state trooper who was actually the one who a state trooper pulled me over last June, but a state trooper who was just charged and pled guilty to making up every single one of the DUI arrests that he wrote as a part of a DUI enforcement unit. Every single one, he said he made up. Now that's an extreme example of an incentive structure gone wrong. And I thank our Attorney General for prosecuting in that case moving forward. But when you have that type of structure, where are you going to go to get those arrests? You're going to go where your biases, where you think there's crime, where you're deployed, and in communities that are already disproportionately interacting with police. So that's one of the many things we need to do, is set up systems to track those better outcomes and reward and promote based on that, at the same time as we focus on these other ways to remove bias that Dr. Ray and others are working on. So I'll pause there. I don't know if others want to comment.
I think everything you just said, Councilman, really hits home. Part of what happens in policing is that policing collects deficit data and also rewards deficit approaches, meaning negative outcomes, arrest and the like. And we need to start rewarding different types of outcomes. The interesting thing you also said is the experience you had being pulled over, and now that same officer is found to literally be a bad apple. One of the things that I've always said about law enforcement after studying it for so long is that as much as people talk about bad apples, we have to be very realistic about where bad apples come from. Bad apples come from rotten trees. And when you have bad apples and you allow them to proliferate, they start to have a larger impact. And I think that some of the ways to actually deal with these bad apples is to perform these audits, as we're talking about, like Dr. Bonner-Thompson's team has already started doing. And part of what will probably be revealed in Montgomery County, like basically all other departments that I've researched and studied and worked with, is that there are a core group of officers who are these bad apples over time, who are not only doing bad things, but also costing the municipality millions of dollars. So part of doing comprehensive data reporting not only is about who's doing things correctly, who's not doing things correctly, but it's also about the cost that is costing taxpayers, not only the mental, physical, and emotional health cost, but also the financial cost to the municipality. I mean, when we start looking at civilian payouts for police misconduct, those monies come from taxpayers' money. And oftentimes it doesn't come out the police budget. Like, these are important changes that Montgomery County could think about that would shift accountability and lead to a change in some of the outcomes that we see.
And
let's go.
I think that was so well said. One thing that I'll add to that is, first I'll say it's heartbreaking to hear that, Ms. Vivian, your son is only 23 years old and he's already had multiple negative experiences with police and been pulled over so many times. So he's younger than me and this has already happened. I think a major key here is even if it doesn't result in arrest, even if, the officer that says, oh, I made a mistake and, lets you go, which, happens, I suppose. If they're being pulled over, if your son is being pulled over in the first place, or if your son is being stopped in the first place, if there's interaction in the first place, it's already a problem, even if everything goes well and they, comport themselves in the best way. And so part of what Young People for Progress and a number of the organizations that we're working with are trying to do is look as how do we decrease, the number of those interactions from even occurring. And one of the things that I think Dr. Tompkins flashed on the screen in some of the projects being worked on is looking at removing traffic enforcement and moving that to the Department of Transportation, right? We know that the biggest traffic enforcement issue or thing that was cited was speeding, right? Automated traffic enforcement works with speeding without having your son have to be pulled over. Berkeley, California did it. There are other cities that are following. There are solutions. We have them. We have community support for them. We just need leaders with the courage to work together to make these things happen.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So next question is from Emily. So Emily asked, what can they do as a community to advocate to remove school resource officers from schools? And she also asked, she has a two-part question. Do you guys want to do the first question first before I come out to the second part, or are you okay hearing both questions?
You can ask both.
Okay, so the second part basically is the American School Counselor Association recommends 250 students to one counselor. And so asking for feedback on whether that would be, whether you commit to advocating for every school to have that. So that would be for Emily. Second question, Councilmember Jawando and Dr. Ray and Danielle, if you so desire.
Yes, so I've worked a lot on this issue. I think we took a vote in the council last month, or 2 months ago now, I guess, in end of July, to remove half of the SROs and reallocate that funding in the following fiscal year. I still think that's the right decision because of the second part of the question that was asked. We have one of the worst nurse to student ratios in the region. Our counselor to student ratio is not much better. Our students need trusted adults in a safe school environment. And that money is better used, that $3 million a year, on those types of interventions and others, in addition to our school security staff, which does a great job. And it's not to say that our police officers that are SROs are bad people. I know many of them, they are not. They care about kids. This is about how do we spend money and resources on the things that are most needed and are going to have the best impact and outcome for our students. When we know that there is disproportionality in the arrests that Ms. Blocker mentioned earlier, 50% of the students arrested over the last 4 years are Black. They represent 1/5 of the population. And so I'm going to continue to work on that. I know we don't all agree on the council right now, but I think there's been significant progress. The school board's also looking at this issue. And so I think it's a good example of using resources in a better way. That doesn't mean police can't come and do programming and meet with our students and talk about the jobs they do. That can happen, but they don't need to be in an enforcement role in the schools, in my view.
And I also just want to second what Councilmember Jawando said. I think that is just absolutely correct, that we need to look at what is the best scenario, right? And the best picture for what we want students' experience to be like, and what school safety looks like. And having counselors, right, and nurses as some of those things, as well as Montgomery County Public Schools' phenomenal security and other folks, is really important. And I want to say that we really commend you on being a leader on this issue, and first introducing it through the Public Safety Committee, and then as a budget savings measure, and that there are a number of community groups and organizations who support this, not only with shifting for 12 police officers so that we can have counselors, et cetera, but looking at how we can completely shift this, right? To say that we don't need any police officers in an enforcement role in our schools, and that those resources would much better be used still with police in the community that can be called in, right? But with restorative justice, right? With nurses, with counselors. And there is support from organizations for that complete reimagining of what that looks like.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'd like to go to some live questions. So Dr. Bada Tompkins and Natalia, if you can address these questions, please. How is data on race, ethnicity, and gender collected?
So it varies by the database that is being used. So for the traffic violations data set that I was referencing in our report, that data on race and ethnicity are collected because of a state law that requires it. And that state law requires both race and ethnicity. In this particular case, the police officer makes a determination as to what they consider to be the race of the driver, the race or ethnicity of the driver. In other cases, for example, when when there is a 911 call that is logged into a database called the CAD, which is the Computer Aided Dispatch System, and that is based on the observation of the caller. However, one limitation of that database is that information is not logged as a field, so it can't be, the data can't be kind of looked at in aggregate or analyzed because it's kind of just referenced in a narrative. So that's one challenge. In other cases, you see, for example, in use of force reports, there's a form that officers fill out, and there is a field for officers to fill in a race. In that particular case, one limitation is that it doesn't give the option or prompt officers to fill in ethnicity. So we may have a situation where we might be undercounting individuals who are Latinx because the officer determined that to categorize them as white. So it kind of varies depending on the situation and what laws apply.
Dr. Bonner-Tompkins, is that good?
That's perfect.
Perfect. So that was Julia's question. So Miriam asked, how does the data presented by Dr. Tompkins correlate to the data shared by the police department? Can you answer that?
So the data that we're reporting is data from the police department. So it's not, we relied on the police department and existing data sources to pull this report together. So there is, it's their data.
Okay. And from Brian asked about what accounts for such high percentages of other in traffic stops.
Sure, so that's a really good question. I am not 100, that's one of those that we would need to do a little bit of a deeper dive. One thing, as I mentioned just now, the officer kind of determines the race of or ethnicity of the person, of the driver. In order to produce that chart in the presentation that we showed, we used data from the Census Bureau. So it may be that there is a little bit of a mismatch between what the census considers other and what is considered other by the officers that are making that determination. But there certainly could be other factors. As I had mentioned, all the data in the report merit further investigation.
Okay, thank you. So this question is for Councilmember Jawando. So there is, it's based on your use of force bill. And the question from Paul is that in July, the County Council voted to update our police use of force policy, but up to this point, he hasn't really seen what it does and when anything will happen. What is the immediate impact of this policy? When can we anticipate it to be fully implemented?
Sure, I'll be very brief, and then I would like Dr. Ray to comment on this as well. The use of force legislation, which was a landmark bill that all my colleagues supported, did several things. It banned chokeholds, banned striking individuals who are restrained. It required officers to intervene when they see an officer committing a crime or using excessive force, and then requiring them to report that intervention, and protects the officer when they do intervene. And it also limits no-knock warrants, the type we saw in the case of Brown and Taylor, and we've had some incidences here in the county as well. And very importantly, it raised the standard of when deadly force can be used from reasonable to necessary after all other de-escalation and other reasonable alternatives have been used. And that's really important, as you heard Dr. Ray talk about earlier, about that type of de-escalation training and that being the go-to and the focus. And so the chief of police is directed to promulgate a new use of force policy within 6 months of the legislation. So we should see something coming out of the department within 5 months or so. And part of the law also required that that be done in conjunction with community input of vulnerable populations. And I just want to, as I turn it to Dr. Ray for his comment on any of this, but particularly use of force, I just want to clear up that the state trooper who pulled me over was not the state trooper who was in the DUI unit. It was a different state trooper. I just want to make sure that was clear so that we correct the record. But Dr. Ray.
Yeah, thanks for that, Councilman Jawando. I think I made that mistake on the officer, but I think the bad apples thing still applies. So, I mean, I think the use of force legislation is really, really important. And I think one thing that's important for people in Montgomery County to know is that when departments or municipalities, in this case, Montgomery County, is going through a change and is being a leader in a space, oftentimes you go to places where, meaning as a community, that are going to be difficult, but it's because you're paving a way for other areas. And I view Montgomery County as doing that, not only in the state of Maryland, but throughout the country. When I look at the work that is being done in Montgomery County compared to other places, earlier we heard Danielle mention Berkeley, California. I actually lived there. My kids were born in Oakland when I was working at UC Berkeley. That is another place that we can compare Montgomery County to in terms of some of the changes that's being made. At the same time, agreeing with everything Councilman Jawando said, and I think that these legislations are going to be extremely important. At the same time, we also have to deal at the state level with the Law Enforcement Bill of Rights. And we have to recognize that no matter kind of what's happening at a county level or a city level, that until we deal with the Law Enforcement Bill of Rights, that there are going to be limitations that happens in terms of accountability at the county level. So what that means is not just paying attention to your county council people, but also talking to your state senators and state delegates, looking at who is on the Judicial Affairs Committee in the state Senate and the House of Delegates and dealing with that. And then obviously on the federal level is dealing with qualified immunity. And what's important for people to recognize is that qualified immunity deals with civil liability and culpability, not necessarily criminal liability. The problem, however, is that qualified immunity is interpreted as applying to criminal proceedings. And it's interpreted that way from prosecutors, oftentimes defense attorneys, judges, and juries in terms of holding police officers accountable. I think one big shift that would make Montgomery County a huge leader in this space is dealing with civilian payouts for police misconduct. There are ways to work around the Law Enforcement Bill of Rights and also work around qualified immunity. I've written about this a lot. I think it is shifting civilian payouts away from tax money, which can be invested in social services and education and work infrastructure, and transfer that to police department insurance policy. Now, that still means that the municipality will cover, or Montgomery County will still cover that premium. But what it allows is for the police chief and the county council to have more accountability and oversight. And also for officers, good officers who are trying to really, really do their job, which is the majority of them, to also hold those bad apples accountable, to have a market-driven approach to know how much money those bad apples are costing the taxpayers of Montgomery County. And I think we'll see that change having a big impact on the ways that police officers treat people, particularly the disproportionate ways that police officers treat people by race.
So I should have said earlier, my apologies, due to time, I'm going to be sort of pointing to people when I ask the question. So this one came in live, Dr. Ray. And Amy asked, can you provide a reliable reference on the origins of US policing? I was aware of policing starting in New York City, but not that it had its roots in slave patrols. And she's interested in learning more.
Yeah, I'll just quickly say I would say refer to some of the work that myself and my colleagues have been doing at the Brookings Institution. You can simply go to the Brookings Institution, you can look at my name, you can put in police, and you'll see a series of reports that highlight this. And in particular, one of the key pieces is a piece I wrote called Bad Apples Come from Rotten Trees and Policing. For people who are also interested in defunding the police and thinking about reallocating and shifting funding, I actually wrote a piece called What is Defund the Police and Does it have merits? You can actually just search defund the police and that'll pop up. I think those are two good sources. And the key thing is not just reading what I wrote, but also the citations I include. So the hyperlinks that are in those pieces that are highlighted, click on those. That'll take you to longer documents and a lot of additional information for people who want to know about this. I mean, as Councilman Jawando said, I mean, it's an unfortunate reality that in the United States of America, law enforcement originates from slave patrols as slaves were fleeing plantations. And despite we have this narrative some type of way that people weren't trying to fight for their freedom, they were. People should see Harriet if you haven't, and that'll give you a good picture of that. But a lot of that was happening in Maryland. Maryland, sitting at the Mason-Dixon line, has always done a lot of this work. And so that's a place where I would go to. I think Brookings has some of the most comprehensive and best data on these issues.
Thank you very much. So I have a question that is directed to Councilmember Jawando. And the question is about supporting police officers and to be, along with being critical of bad policing. And this is Maureen. Maureen says, along with being critical of bad policing, we should be supportive of good policing. Others, all police, I guess all police feel under siege. How are we going to support them and help them? And her issue is that in rethinking public safety, the issues are many and varied, but there are times when the issue is not just the police force, but also the police union. What would be our relationship with the police union going forward? Councilmember Jawando.
Thank you for the question, Maureen. It's an important one. It's a tough job to be a police officer, and especially now. And as I mentioned, I grew up in Quebec Terrace and Long Branch, which is an area where just a couple of weeks ago we had a shooting, and my daily nightly occurrence was hearing gunshots and having crime, and I lost a friend to gun violence while I was in high school, and so I was very aware of the need for police, but also the disparities of police. And for many people of color, that is a duality that you live with. And so one of the reasons I did the internship and with the police as an AmeriCorps member, and then later with the FBI, was because I was interested in law enforcement. I ended up going to law school and going that route. But I have great respect for our police officers. And in many ways, they're dealing with a lot of societal problems. We've talked about it today: mental health, homelessness. And so how do we shift funding so that they aren't having to deal with those challenges in those ways? But also, how do we make sure that we are changing the incentive structure, which I talked about earlier? I think that's another way, positive outcomes. And then we need to pay our police officers more. This isn't always a popular view, but I think if you're going to demand high standards, you need to pay people well and then hold them accountable to those standards. And here in Montgomery County, one of the things that we know is good for police officers to do is to live in the jurisdiction you police. If you're a starting police officer in Montgomery County making $50,000 a year, and if you have a family or you don't, that makes that very difficult to do. We're 5th out of 6 in the region of starting police officer salary. That's why I supported giving an increase to our first year officers and voted for that even in the midst of this pandemic. And so I think we also need to invest more into the training of our officers. We do 24 weeks here in Montgomery County. It depends on where in the country. It's somewhere between 14 weeks and 20 some odd weeks. In other countries, they do 2 or 3 years of training, focused on their job, on constitutional policing. Countries like Germany and Denmark and Sweden. I think we have an opportunity to be a model for how to expand that type of training here, especially since we already include a requirement for a college associate's degree or equivalency. So there's some things I think we can do to support our police officers, pay them more, shift burdens from things that they're covering that they shouldn't be covering. And that's also going to have the great double benefit of reducing negative interactions and calls for service that are not involved with violent crime, and which is what our police need to be focused on.
Thank you very much. So I have another question that's directed at you, Councilmember Jawando. Sorry.
Those are coming. Somebody, go ahead. Yeah.
So this one is personally to you, asking about defunding the police, your support for, or rather that you're against defunding the police, and for you to basically explain whether you understand that doesn't mean no services for the police, no public safety system, but actually needs to take money away from the police to build a better public safety system that reduces and eventually eliminates the need for police. So that's directed at you.
Yeah, no, what defunding means and why I've been comfortable using it is that it really means reimagining what public safety is and what policing is, which is the point of this town hall. Now, some of that needs to come with reallocation of resources, and we've taken some steps already. For example, on the council to expand our crisis intervention teams to 6, from 1 to 6, so that they can respond when folks have mental health crises. We're exploring programs like the Cahoots program in Eugene, Oregon, rather, and other programs where you have people deployed that aren't law enforcement to deal with people experiencing mental health crises or homelessness. We've talked about the SRO issue. That would be a reallocation of resources. We talked about changing the incentive structure. If you change the incentive structure, you don't, of our 911 calls, only 10% are for violent crimes. And so we're looking into those calls and breaking them down, and where do police really need to respond. And so I think if you do all those things and look at this data, there's an opportunity to change the way we envision public safety, which will include changing how we fund public safety. But you have to do those things in a deliberate way, and so that you're making sure that those gaps are covered, and you're providing the social supports for the community. So that's what I think reimagine is. I'd love to hear Dr. Ray and maybe Danielle chime in on that, because that's kind of a big question.
Dr. Ray, I'll let you take this one first.
Oh, okay. I was just going to quickly say, yeah, I think when we talk about defund the police, it's 2 parts to it, right? There are some people who go even more extreme than that, but defund the police, to Councilman Jawando's point, is about reallocating funding. And this gets back to what we were saying about calls for service. One of the big things nationally is that the homicide clearance rate, meaning the percentage of homicides that are solved, I mean, it's really abhorrent. It's only about 60%. So about 40% of homicides go unsolved every year, 66% of rapes, 70% of robberies, and 50% of aggravated assaults. If police officers had the opportunities to dig deep with certain types of crimes, instead of going wide with everything, we might see the crime solvability rate go up, which is what everyone wants, no matter which type of neighborhood they're in. And the other thing about this, about the reallocating, is about taking this market-driven approach to think about calls for service. So of course, Montgomery County is talking about traffic stops as an example. I also think, to Councilman Jawando's point, it's important to not only think about reallocating, but also shifting. And the way we should think about this is reinvesting in the community. And a lot of police departments and a lot of municipalities, Montgomery County is a part of this, nearly 1 out of every 3 general funds from taxpayers goes to law enforcement. We have to think about if that is the way that money should be allocated, and whether or not money should be put to other sorts of resources. And accordingly, when it comes to shifting within police departments, look, police officers work hard every single day. They are oftentimes underpaid. They are overworked. They are overstressed. Councilman Jawando just talked about their starting pay. You know, there are things that can be done about that when shifting funding. It could be increasing salaries, but it could also be people in Montgomery County thinking that they want police officers to experience their communities. Earlier, Councilman Jawando talked about that if you live in different parts of the county, you have different experiences with law enforcement. That's true. That's also because law enforcement have different experiences in the community. While they fully embrace certain communities, go to church in those communities, send their kids there, exercise there, go to restaurants there. There are other parts of the county that hardly none of them live in. Imagine if there was a housing mandate that gave them more money to live, but then also allowed them to experience the department. And one thing that's really important, as I look at some of the questions and comments, being a police officer is a job. It's not an identity. You know, our identities are things that we can't change. People can actually change their jobs and careers, but being a police officer is a really, really important job. And we want to make sure that they have the resources they need to be successful, which includes not only housing, but also mental health. Final thing I'll say is national data I've analyzed shows that 80% of officers suffer from chronic stress. They are depressed, they're anxious, and about 1 in 6 report suicidal thoughts and substance abuse problems. When we shift funding, we need to make sure that we mandate them having the mental health services they need to take care of their own minds and do their jobs well.
Absolutely. And just to add on to that, I'll also say that I have family who are current and former police officers, and I have different stories, but I love and respect them a lot. And from there, I can say that we ask police to do too much in some instances, right? Police should not be the first, they shouldn't have to be the first and only responders to a lot of issues, right? When we make police responsible for a lot of quality of life problems that involve just different things like mental distress, and mental health issues that different people have, housing and homelessness issues, other things, we could be reinvesting that money to things that prevent some of those problems from occurring or prevent some of those problems from becoming so extreme in the first place. What if we shifted some of that to, for example, in schools, mental health, et cetera, more support, right? That would prevent the need for some things in the community, things like shifting some of that money to housing and homelessness services, free, safe, and accessible public spaces, right? Would eliminate some of these issues, whether, loitering or more serious. And so that police aren't expected to have to respond to so much, but also that the community gets a lot of investment that comes in the form of, investment that is not punitive necessarily, or kind of after the fact. And so I completely agree that is something that's important and something that we really need to look seriously at doing more of.
Okay.
And that we have, 6 proposals on that we're actively working to make happen.
Thank you. So we have a question from Roberto. He says he's an assistant public defender with the Maryland Office of the Public Defender in Montgomery County. And he wanted to thank you first, Councilmember Jawando, for reimagination of our police safety in Montgomery County. So his question is in reference to moving funds around and whether you support the reallocating of funds from the police department to different sources, including whether or not we should have and another question that's related to the PD's office is whether or not we should have police officers do stops or whether we should move that to a different department. Councilmember Jawando.
Sure, I think this builds off of what we were just talking about. Yes, I do think that the reallocation of resources is appropriate. I think if we focus on violent crime, on the most important times we need police to be there, some of the things that Dr. Ray mentioned as far as clearance rates and change our prioritization of our incentive structure, I think you'd be able to have a more highly trained, better paid, smaller, focused police force. I think that's where we can head, and you need only look at other countries to see that that's possible. And I think that reallocation will need to happen over time and in a strategic way, and not overnight. If you noticed, one of the OLO reports that is going to be on the docket this year, it's looking at the feasibility of moving things like traffic enforcement or components of traffic enforcement away from police officers, and studying that. So that's a report we'll be getting. And I think that's an example of a potential reallocation in addition to SROs, in addition to looking at positive measures and outcomes. I think those are all ways that you can move in that direction. So I think that is something that I see as a vision for where we need to go and where law enforcement needs to go as we reimagine it nationwide. But I really think Montgomery County can be a leader because we have a good department. We're starting with some good bones. Our crime rates are continuing to drop. I know that's a common misperception. On the most part, our crime goes down, and when we have a great community, and obviously there's some outliers, but that's the consistent trend. So yes, I think we should head in that direction.
Thank you very much, Councilmember Jawando. So I think we're gonna try to wrap up soon because it's 8:36 and we've been on for about an hour and a half. So quick question, with this report that we have now, what do we do with it? What's the next step?
Well, I can chime in. We're going to pass a bill related to the recommendations, and then take the data and keep moving. I mean, I'm glad Councilmember Katz and President Katz has been able to be here the whole time. We appointed a police advisory commission that was just seated, a 13-member body that its job is to make recommendations and look at police policy and practice. County executive is looking at a task force that to make recommendations. So this will be an ongoing process to continue to move this forward. I know the police department is also reviewing their policies. They're writing a new use of force policy. So this is going to be an ongoing conversation. And I think this tonight, in my view, I think you can't overemphasize the importance of people understanding that we have disparate data here, and we need to dig into that. We need to understand, of those 57% of use of force incidences that are Black residents, what are they for? Where did they happen? Why did they happen? Of those traffic stops, same thing. Why is a Black person, 7 or 8 times more likely to be pulled over in Bethesda than a white person, even though those populations are flipped on its head? And I meant to mention that earlier, how amazing that statistic is, considering how segregated we are, that you're more likely to be pulled over in Bethesda as a Black person than you are in the eastern part of the county, where there's the majority of our African-American residents. And so I think we need to have answers to those questions, and then change and then proceed in a way over time to put in policies in place, many of which have been mentioned by Dr. Ray, and I know Ms. Blocker has some suggestions. I have suggestions. The other colleagues have suggestions, so that we can start changing, moving this ship, this 400 plus year ship that is the criminal justice system, which is not in isolation to the other issues that we see in mental health and homelessness, in our economic areas. We know those are all connected to this. So I think those are the next steps. It's a big task, but it's something we have to do. I don't know if Dr. Ray or anybody wants to comment. I think maybe we do one more question.
Sure, I'll add on that.
Yeah.
I'll say that Young People for Progress is working with 24 other organizations on 6 things that we know will be significant in improving this issue. And so what we would really like is to, for other folks who support those things, who are watching this town hall, to express your support and voice your experiences and opinions on the solutions that you want. And then also for Councilmember Jawando, you specifically, this coalition of organizations, really want to work with you on how we can remove police officers from schools in an enforcement role and replace those with other staff, other resources that will help you thrive in other ways, specifically as you're a leader on this, as well as those 6 things that you've expressed support for, whether looking into shifting traffic enforcement, reinvesting in some other things, and then also harm reduction. So thank you.
Dr. Ray, any suggestions for us here in Montgomery County about how we follow up on this?
I mean, I think this hopefully has been really, really helpful. I mean, I think you and others are really leading the way, not just in Montgomery County and the state, but across the country. I mean, there are people on here watching who are viewing this from across the country, trying to figure out what Montgomery County is doing it. So, I mean, I think we laid out a lot of things that Montgomery County is considering. And I think with the data that Dr. Brown and Tompkins' team and Natalia and others are putting together, it'll continue to put Montgomery County ahead of the curve, so that hopefully at the end of the day, that police officers and the civilians they interact with can get home to their families safely.
Great. Do we have anything, and do we have another question, Fatmata, or can we wrap up?
No, we're gonna wrap up. It's 8:41.
Okay.
So Councilmember Jawando, to thank everyone for attending.
Yes, please. Thank you. And thank you all for joining. We will answer again, I know there are I see 136 questions in the chat. So we will make sure that we catalog those and get responses to people. So I hope my staff is working on that, and really appreciate. I know at our high point we had almost 400 people in here, and we stream this to Facebook and YouTube. So there's probably others that were viewing there as well. So thank you for joining. Again, this is going to be an ongoing conversation, and I want to thank our staff and OLO. I want to thank Council President and Chair of Public Safety, my colleague Sydney Katz. We often talk about together. It often is not lost on me that we are on this council at the same time in our roles for a reason. And he attended segregated schools in Montgomery County in first grade, and I had a very different life experience. But we are good friends and care about these issues deeply. And I think we can make significant progress. So thank you to Dr. Ray, all the work you're doing nationally and locally for being a resource to us here in Montgomery County and in the state. And I want to thank Fatmata, and I want to thank Danielle Blocker and YPP and all of our partners, Casa de Maryland, Montgomery County ACLU. I'm going to miss somebody here. Kingdom
Racial
Fellowship,
Justice Now.
Racial Justice Now, Kingdom Fellowship AME Church, the Social Action Committee, and everyone anyone, I think CASA. So there's some others. If I missed you, I'm sorry, but thank you. We will follow up with these Q&As, and if you have questions of us, please send us an email or reach out on social media. So thank you all for joining, and good night.
CUAH and Susan Farag is on.
Yes, Susan Farag from our staff. Thank you, Susan. I know you've been answering questions in the chat. And Communities United Against Hate. That's right. Thank you. All right. Good night, everybody. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.